Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. While housing is largely a provincial matter, the federal government is under increasing pressure to address the national housing crisis. The CMHC has already told us that we need to double housing starts in this country if we're going to meet demand. But meddling in municipal affairs is likely to just bog down an already sluggish process. Meet Benjamin Dachis, the Associate Vice President of Public Affairs at the C.D. Howe Institute. He says there are ways Ottawa can get involved beyond the existing GST rebate for builders putting shovels in the ground on purpose-built rentals. He joins us now. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on the show today.
In your intelligence memo titled The Proper Federal Role in Housing, you point out that a break on the GST should be expanded beyond the rental unit construction, and that at the time that the tax was introduced, it didn't really apply to single-family homes until the price tag was north of, what, $350,000?
Exactly. So the way that the federal GST rebate works is that right now, if you're building a house that's going to be occupied by its eventual owner, there's a rebate that you get or you apply for your GST that would eventually be paid by the owner. The way it works, though, is that that rebate only is going to kick in or at values below $350,000, and then it gradually gets wound back as a home increases in value beyond $450,000. And now the question, I think, for everyone is, where the heck can you find a home for more than $350,000, so especially as a new home? Those numbers come from the 1990s. And back in the 1990s, early 1990s, those rebates apply to about 90% of homes. Certainly in terms of like the top end, 90% of homes would have been getting some GST relief. Now it's the exact opposite, where 90% of homes are going to be paying most of the GST. So the fact that these thresholds have not been indexed to inflation for decades is driving a huge increase in price in construction costs for new homes.
Yeah, I think in 1990, $350,000 would get you what we would have derisively referred to as a McMansion.
Exactly.
Now, when we spoke with the CMHC on the podcast about these issues, they did point out that it wasn't just single-family homes we needed to focus on. We did need to focus on purpose-built rentals. And for rentals, if the GST break was a good start, how would rethinking depreciating thresholds for owners of rental buildings take the idea to the next level, as you suggest?
Exactly. So there are some really deep questions I think we need to ask ourselves in the tax system about how we treat income for rental properties. Because, for example, rental income in the residential sector is up against capital gains income that, for most people who own a home, is tax-free. We're not talking about rental income versus capital gains income in the regular economy, where there is an attempt, at least in terms of equalization, even though there's only a partial inclusion. Here, there's no inclusion of capital gains. So it's a very different world, even to begin with. So then you start getting into some questions about some of the tactical or specific things that you want to do on rental income. Depreciation is one starting point. There's other ideas out there in terms of creating a broader investment tax credit for investment in low income or affordable or attainable rental housing. So there are lots of different options that the government needs to think about that are very much within its boundaries as at least the federal government, in terms of administering the tax system that really should be thinking about for rental income or rental properties.
Help me understand this, though. I'm not a tax accountant. I don't even play one on TV. How would treating rental income the same way as capital gains move the needle on more units? It sounds like we're just putting more money in a developer's pocket.
Yeah, it's worth keeping in mind that the rental system, being a owner of a rental property, is a brutal business. For example, in most provinces, you, as an owner of a rental property, you're subject to various forms of rent control. You're subject to capital that faces significant risk, significant social risk in terms of where government policy risk. But then the bigger story is there a bigger social good in terms of housing? in the sense that this is but what many people have described as requiring a wartime effort in terms of how much effort we're going to put into investing in housing. Is there a case for rethinking how we treat rental income to ensure that companies have an incentive in a very difficult business to invest more?
So at the end of the day, this would mean that I put up a building that's designed to be rented out, and the income I get from that would be pure profit. I don't have to give it back to the government. That's what incentivizes me to have an apartment building for rent in the first place.
Yeah. So again, the approach that we take in Canada, which is the right one to get as much housing built as possible, as affordably to the government and taxpayers as possible, is private developers. This is the way in which we can get more housing built. And this is the way in which we can ensure that people who need housing the most, people at the low end, get it. It is through investors. It is through private development. The question becomes, what are the right ways in which we, through the tax system, can encourage investment? One of the things that's really tricky in the rental world is that there's various different tax treatments of a wide variety of providers. There's lots of nonprofit providers. There are providers that are real estate investment trusts. They have a tax system. There are investors that are owned by institutional investors. So there's a huge range of tax treatments that we have to be really careful about when we're thinking about any policy changes. So I wouldn't advise rushing ahead on any specific change on rental. We just need to have a real conversation about what are the various approaches that we can take to encourage more investment.
Yeah, but how long do we have to keep having a real conversation, Ben? As far back as 2009, the Institute was calling for a U.S.-style rental housing investment tax credit.
Oh yeah, so that's an example of something that can be done. That's why that's a specifically good idea, because that's a policy that works for rental providers of any tax treatment. It'll work for nonprofits. It works for private developers. It works for a wide range of providers. So that's something that we absolutely should be looking into. Deeper questions about where we should take the treatment of rental income in general pose deep questions about our tax system that should be part of any tax reform that this or any future government goes into.
Expanding the housing subsidy, known as the Canada Housing Benefit, would require working with the provinces. What's the risk of that becoming a politicized process?
It definitely does risk becoming a politicized process whenever you have federal provincial negotiation, but it has worked in the past. And the system that we ended up creating back in about 7 or 8 years ago is a really good model. The Canada Housing Benefit is a better approach to supporting a wide range of people in housing need. Because rather than other approaches that only say support people in social housing or only support people in who own their homes, for example, with supports for people to reduce their property taxes if they own their home and have low income. The Canada Housing Benefit supports people across the housing spectrum. And so it's neutral as to whether, what kind of home that you're going to be in. It very much is the right approach to be the lowest cost way of ensuring that people in the most dire housing need get that support for housing.
You said something interesting back there, and it's about the fact that this is the biggest need for housing since the wartime effort to provide the returning veterans with the houses that gave us all these little bungalow-style cottages in the suburbs of cities like Toronto and Vancouver and elsewhere. Why not suggest Ottawa get back involved in the housing process of actually putting shovels in the ground like we did back then?
Yeah, because it goes to a fundamental rule in government policy. It's that when everyone is responsible for a problem, no one's responsible. And we need to remember at the end of the day, which levels of government really control the levers in terms of getting a house built and facilitating getting things done. And it is entirely at the provincial and municipal level. So if the federal government is trying to intervene directly into municipal decisions, it's going to just end up making more parties responsible, and therefore no one's actually going to be accountable. And that's just a starting point in terms of the federal potential federal missteps that might happen.
You're concerned that this is a pass the buck situation.
It absolutely becomes a pass the buck situation as a starting point of the problem. But let me give you another example of a problem. As that what we've been hearing about in terms of the kind of the high level litmus test of whether the federal government is going to support any municipal government's housing plan is whether they're going to allow 4 units to be built as of right in any lot. Now that's a great goal. Don't get me wrong. That's an absolutely wonderful goal to have in terms of supporting more housing growth. But the question becomes, what else are cities doing? And whether that's just the one rule that they introduce, is that going to be what's going to be sufficient for the federal money? What if cities start dramatically increasing development charge costs, or put in place other rules in terms of heritage designation or other policies that end up slowing down housing, even though they've passed this one specific test that the federal government is going to introduce? The federal government simply cannot be looking at every municipality on every single part of their zoning rules in 10 different provincial planning regimes and peer deep enough into their policies to know what's going to work in terms of their municipal process. The federal government needs to be focused on outcomes and a process that the provinces are going to impose to ensure that cities are going to meet that goal.
Your intelligence memo stresses the importance of Ottawa not getting in the way of municipalities, but they are notorious for red tape. What's the federal solution to that municipal problem?
Well, one thing that the federal government can do to really support a deeper understanding of the extent of the red tape problem in Canadian municipalities is get better data on this. Because even when the provinces try to do this for their own municipal governments, things get tricky. For example, the province of Ontario is introduced, for example, regulation or new rules in some recent Planning Act changes that specify timelines for an official review. The problem, though, becomes that cities start unofficial reviews, and that's really difficult to measure when you're just looking at a provincially designated system of what an official review looks like. What we really need to have is a system and a program in which we're testing across various different jurisdictions how long it takes to actually get stuff in the ground. And the good news is we don't need to start this from scratch. Is that the World Bank, after a bit of a pause during the pandemic before, is restarting its what was called business ready to do that and to go look at individual cities when they in terms of how long it takes to get something done. Taxes are part of it, resolving contracts is part of it, but the core thing that Canadian cities have always been really bad at has been on getting a building permit or getting an electricity connection. But the only reason we know that, in terms of what a Canadian city is that that's only for Toronto, because the World Bank has only done that study for any given country for the largest city. They need the government to directly ask for this study. So the federal government needs to have the political courage to ask for the study, because what it's going to mean is that some cities that have been laggards in terms of long approval times, uncertain processes, they're going to be called out by this process, and the federal government needs to have the fortitude to be able to put a lens on cities about how long it takes them to get stuff done.
So essentially shame a municipality into cutting red tape.
Yeah, effectively, yes. But we need to do this comprehensively, and we need to have a system of rewards behind that, where if they can reduce red tape, get more, make it faster, get stuff done, there should be reward for it. And again, this is what I mean in terms of being focused on outcomes. That's the kind of thing that governments can be focused on to get more stuff built.
Yeah, the World Bank idea is an interesting thought, particularly because then it sort of takes the hot potato out of the hands of the federal government, creates a layer of transparency, and it's an independent third party making these assessments.
Exactly. There's no lobbying the World Bank in terms of, at least there shouldn't be, because they're going to be, this is something to be blunt about it. This is a problem that the World Bank faced in terms of why they stopped the process before. They're now going to be, in my opinion, very sensitive to that in terms of making sure that does not happen anymore. So if they can be the group that's going to administer the system, it's going to be much easier for the federal government to be able to say, our hands are tied in terms of the outcome that we're measuring. We're going to be focused on what they're going to be measuring, and we will be rewarding based on that.
So, Benjamin, if there was a public policy analyst or a policy maker watching or listening to this conversation, if there was one thing you wanted them to walk away with, what would it be?
It's that the federal government needs to really empower the provinces and really drive the provinces to administer housing reform. We're seeing this right now in terms of the provincial level, a lot stepping back from some of their commitments. What we saw in late October, of the province of Ontario reversing some of the official plan changes is going to be quite dramatically negative in terms of housing supply. That's just an example of the sort of things that the provinces really have to administer for municipalities to act. And it's the federal government that should be really working with the provinces to create a system like official plan amendments, as an example, or whatever system is going to take place after this, to really make sure that municipalities get stuff built. Again, when the federal government's directly intervening in hundreds of different municipal governments, it's not going to be scalable. It's not going to be able to think long term, but it can work with the provinces. But 10 provinces, and frankly fewer than that are really the source of the problem, and it can create the right incentives with them to ensure that they are setting the right framework for municipalities to get stuff built.
Ben, it's always great speaking with you. Thank you for your time and insight.
Thanks for having me on.
Benjamin Dachis is an Associate Vice President of Public Affairs at the C.D. Howe Institute and the author of the Intelligence Memo titled The Proper Federal Role in Housing. Read it at cdhowe.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thanks for joining us.
You've been listening to the C.D. Howe Institute podcast with Michael Hainsworth. Subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, and Spotify. The C.D. Howe Institute is an independent, not-for-profit research institute whose mission is to raise living standards by fostering economically sound public policies. The Institute is widely considered to be Canada's most influential think tank and a trusted source of essential policy intelligence, distinguished by nonpartisan, evidence-based research and subject to definitive expert review. Visit cdhowe.org and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you.